Colorado Territory, 1875. The frontier town of Pine Ridge stood defiant against the wild landscape, a collection of wooden structures and dirt roads nestled between towering mountains and endless prairie. As the evening sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jacob Keller guided his chestnut mare slowly down the main street, dust billowing around the horse's hooves. At 25, Jacob had already seen enough of the West's brutality to last a lifetime. The Civil War had stolen his youth, and 3 years working cattle drives had hardened him into a man who believed the frontier offered no room for softness or sentiment. "A man rides alone in these parts," he often told himself. "Anything else gets you killed." Jacob's lean, muscular frame sat straight in the saddle, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. Though handsome, with his strong jaw, clear blue eyes, and light stubble, few in Pine Ridge had heard more than a dozen words from him since he'd taken work at the Sullivan Ranch 6 months prior. The other hands called him the Ghost for how he moved silently through the world, doing his work with precision but forming no attachments. What they didn't know was that Jacob carried the weight of a failed attempt to protect his family's Texas homestead. Raiders had taken everything while he was away fighting a war that seemed meaningless now. His parents and younger sister were long buried, and with them, Jacob had buried his belief in anything beyond survival. The West was no place for dreams or tenderness. A man survived by keeping his guns clean, his wits sharp, and his heart locked away. As he passed the Gold Nugget Saloon, a commotion erupted from within. The batwing doors burst open as a young woman backed out, pointing a small derringer at a red-faced miner who followed her with hands raised. "I said no, Mr. Daniels, and I meant it," she declared firmly. "Touch me again, and I promise the next shot won't hit the ceiling." Jacob reined his horse to a stop, watching with unexpected interest. The woman couldn't have been more than 20, with cascading auburn hair that caught the last golden rays of sunlight. Her simple blue dress, adorned with a single ribbon at the collar, was modest compared to the saloon girl's attire, yet she carried herself with unmistakable confidence. The drunken miner took another threatening step forward. "Priscilla O'Malley, you're just like your daddy, all threat and no action. Everyone knows you won't pull that trigger." Jacob saw the slight tremor in her hand, the fear beneath her brave facade. Before he could consider the wisdom of his actions, he had dismounted and stepped between them. "Ma'am," he said quietly, tipping his hat to the young woman while keeping his eyes on the miner. "Is there a problem here?" The miner squinted at Jacob, recognition slowly dawning. "Ain't you Sullivan's new hand, the quiet one?" "I am," Jacob replied, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable edge of warning. "And it seems the lady has made her wishes clear." "This ain't your business, Cowboy," the miner growled, swaying slightly. "I'm making it my business," Jacob responded, his hand resting casually near his holster. Something in his calm demeanor must have registered with the drunken man. After a tense moment, the miner spat in the dirt and retreated back into the saloon, muttering obscenities. When Jacob turned to the young woman, she was already securing her derringer in a small pocket hidden in the folds of her skirt. Up close, her eyes were a startling green, intelligent and wary. "Thank you for the assistance, Mr. Keller." "Jacob Keller." "Well, Mr. Keller, while I appreciate the gesture, I had the situation under control." Despite her words, relief was evident in her expression. "I'm Priscilla O'Malley." Jacob nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the conversation. "Miss O'Malley. You're rather new to Pine Ridge, aren't you?" she asked, studying him with unexpected intensity. "6 months at Sullivan's Ranch. And you've managed to avoid town gossip all this time." "That's quite an accomplishment." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Perhaps you haven't heard who my father is." Jacob shrugged. "Not my concern who your kin might be." "Michael O'Malley," she said, watching his face closely. "They called him the Raven of the Rockies before he retired." Even Jacob, isolated as he kept himself, knew that name. Michael O'Malley had been one of the most notorious outlaws in the territory before mysteriously disappearing from that life 5 years ago. Rumor had it he'd stolen enough to retire comfortably, though no one knew where he'd gone. "Seems your father found a way to leave that life behind," Jacob observed neutrally. Yes, well, the town has a longer memory, Priscilla replied, a flash of something vulnerable crossing her features. Being an outlaw's daughter comes with certain assumptions about one's character. For the first time in years, Jacob felt a spark of connection with another person. He understood what it meant to be judged by circumstances beyond one's control. People will always talk, he said simply. Good evening, Miss O'Malley. As he turned to leave, she called after him, Mr. Keller. I work at the general store most days, should you need anything. Jacob nodded but said nothing more as he mounted his horse and continued down the street. He told himself the encounter meant nothing, just another moment in a life spent passing through. Yet as he rode back to the ranch, Priscilla O'Malley's green eyes stayed with him, challenging the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. The following week found Jacob in town for supplies, his list from the ranch foreman tucked in his shirt pocket. He'd told himself his visit to the general store was purely practical, yet he couldn't deny the slight quickening of his pulse when he saw Priscilla behind the counter, her hair pinned up neatly as she tallied figures in a ledger. She looked up at the sound of the bell above the door, recognition and something like pleasure crossing her face. Mr. Keller, what brings you to town? Jacob handed over his list. Ranch supplies. A man of few words, she observed, amusement in her voice as she began gathering the items. They say that about you at Sullivan's, you know, the quiet cowboy who does the work of two men but hardly speaks a dozen words. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. Not much worth saying. I disagree, Priscilla replied, reaching for a box of ammunition on a high shelf. Words matter out here where so much goes unsaid. As she stretched for the box, Jacob noticed a faded bruise on her wrist. Without thinking, he stepped forward and easily retrieved the ammunition, his eyes questioning. Priscilla pulled her sleeve down quickly. Mr. Daniels was more persistent than I initially gave him credit for. But don't worry, my father made sure he understood the error of his ways. Your father is in town then? Jacob asked, surprised by his own curiosity. He owns the livery stable now, she explained, continuing to gather supplies. Respectable business, though many still watch him like he might rob the bank any day. Hard to outrun a reputation. Nearly impossible, she agreed, meeting his gaze, but not entirely. People can change, Mr. Keller. Even in a place as unforgiving as this. There was a challenge in her words that unsettled him. It had been easier believing the West allowed for no redemption, no second chances, easier to remain detached. That'll be $4.35, she said, changing the subject as she finished gathering his supplies. As Jacob counted out the money, their fingers briefly touched across the counter. The simple human contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a reminder of how long he'd gone without such connection. There's a social at the church Saturday next, Priscilla said suddenly, her cheeks coloring slightly. Nothing fancy, just music and some dancing. Most of the town attends. Jacob hesitated. I'm not much for gatherings. Neither am I, truth be told, she confessed. Being the outlaw's daughter doesn't exactly make one the belle of the ball, but the apple pie is worth the discomfort. She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face. Sometimes it's good to remember we're not just surviving out here, Mr. Keller. Sometimes we can live a little too. Jacob gathered his supplies without committing one way or the other. As he reached the door, he paused. Jacob, he said quietly, my name is Jacob. Her smile widened. Jacob then, I'm Priscilla, though my friends call me Pris. Priscilla suits you better, he replied, surprising himself with the observation before stepping back into the harsh sunlight of the street. As he loaded his supplies onto his horse, Jacob caught sight of a tall, imposing man watching him from the entrance of the livery stable across the street. Though older, with silver threading through his dark hair and beard, Michael O'Malley maintained the dangerous air that had once made him the territory's most feared outlaw. Their eyes met briefly, O'Malley's gaze calculating and protective. Jacob tipped his hat respectfully before mounting and riding away. That night, lying in his bunk at the ranch, Jacob found himself thinking of church socials and auburn hair. Fool notion, he muttered to himself. A man survived the frontier by staying focused, unburdened by attachments. Yet for the first time in years, the thought of his solitary existence brought no comfort. Saturday evening arrived with Jacob surprising both himself and the other ranch hands by cleaning up, shaving his stubble, and riding into town. He'd told himself he was just curious about the gathering, nothing more, but the flutter in his stomach when he spotted Priscilla across the churchyard told a different story. She wore a simple green dress that matched her eyes, her auburn hair partly down with simple ribbons woven through it. At 20 years old, she stood apart from the giggling younger girls and gossiping matrons, not quite fitting into either world. When she saw Jacob approaching, genuine surprise and pleasure lit her features. "You came," she said, as though she'd never really expected it. Jacob, uncomfortable in his clean shirt and feeling exposed without his usual protective layer of dust and distance, merely nodded. "You mentioned pie." Her laugh was worth every moment of discomfort. "I did indeed, come on then." The evening unfolded unlike anything Jacob had experienced since before the war. There was music from a small group of local musicians, tables laden with food brought by the townswomen, and an atmosphere of community that Jacob had deliberately kept himself from for years. Yet with Priscilla beside him, explaining who everyone was with quiet asides and gentle humor, he found himself relaxing incrementally. "That's Sheriff Holloway," she whispered, nodding toward a graying man watching the proceedings with a vigilant eye. "He and my father have an unusual arrangement. They pretend not to know each other's past, and everyone pretends to believe them." "Your father's here?" Jacob asked, scanning the crowd. "He'll arrive later." "He doesn't much care for these gatherings, but he comes for my sake," she hesitated. "People are kinder to me when he's not around, less afraid." The sadness in her voice struck Jacob deeply. "Their loss," he said simply. When the dancing began, Jacob remained at the edge of the gathering, content to watch. Priscilla was asked to dance by the young bank clerk, then by the blacksmith's son. Jacob felt an unexpected twist of jealousy watching her move gracefully across the cleared space, though she kept glancing his way. "She's a fine young woman, despite her upbringing." Jacob turned to find Sheriff Holloway beside him, also watching the dancers. "Yes, sir, she is," Jacob agreed cautiously. "Shame about her circumstances. Girl can't help who her daddy is." The sheriff gave Jacob a measuring look. "You're Sullivan's new hand, aren't you?" "Quiet fellow, keeps to himself." "Yes, sir." "Good worker from what I hear, no trouble." The sheriff sipped his coffee. "Just a word of friendly advice, son. Michael O'Malley may have gone straight, but he's still protective of what's his. And nothing's more his than that girl." Before Jacob could respond, the dance ended and Priscilla made her way back to him, slightly flushed from exertion. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod, "I see you've met Mr. Keller." "Just passing the time," Holloway replied easily. "You young folks enjoy the evening." He tipped his hat and moved away, his message to Jacob clearly delivered. "Was he warning you about me or my father?" Priscilla asked, her perceptiveness catching Jacob off guard. "Both, I suspect." "And yet you're still here." She studied him with those remarkable green eyes. "Why is that, Jacob Keller?" The question demanded honesty he wasn't accustomed to giving. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. The musicians began a slower waltz and Priscilla held out her hand. "Dance with me." Jacob stared at her outstretched hand. "I haven't danced since before the war." "Then you're long overdue," her expression softened. "I promise not to judge your rusty steps." Against every instinct that had kept him safe and solitary these past years, Jacob took her hand and led her to the dance floor. His movements were stiff at first, but muscle memory gradually returned. As they moved together, the rest of the gathering seemed to fade away. "People are watching," Jacob observed quietly. "Let them," Priscilla replied with quiet defiance. "I'm used to being the subject of gossip." "Does it bother you what they say?" She considered the question seriously. "It used to break my heart. Now I just feel sorry for them, living such small lives that they need to concern themselves with mine." "That's a generous way to see it." "Not always, some days I'm furious." She looked up at him. "What about you, do you care what they say?" "Never have," Jacob answered truthfully. "Is that why you keep apart, or is there another reason you've built such high walls, Jacob Keller?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Jacob found himself telling her things he'd never spoken aloud. About coming home from the war to find his family's homestead burned and his family gone. About the years spent drifting, taking work where he could find it, never staying anywhere long enough to feel the pain of loss again. I figured out that caring about people or places just gives life more targets, he concluded as the music ended, suddenly embarrassed by how much he'd revealed. Priscilla's eyes held no pity, only understanding. And yet here you are, dancing at a church social. Before he could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Michael O'Malley had arrived, his imposing presence causing a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. He nodded politely to those nearby, but his eyes quickly found his daughter and the man standing close beside her. "That's my cue," Priscilla sighed. "I should go smooth his feathers. He's still not used to seeing me with," she paused, searching for the right word, "friends." "I understand," Jacob replied, stepping back. "Thank you for the dance, Priscilla. Will you wait just for a little while? There's a place behind the church where it's quiet. I'd like to continue our conversation." Against his better judgment, Jacob found himself agreeing. He watched as she crossed to her father, rising on tiptoes to kiss his cheek in greeting. The fearsome former outlaw's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter, though his eyes flicked briefly to Jacob with unmistakable warning. Jacob slipped away from the gathering, finding the quiet spot Priscilla had mentioned, a small garden behind the church with a bench beneath an old oak tree. The sounds of the social continued in the distance, but here the night was peaceful, the stars brilliant overhead. He wasn't sure how long he waited, wondering if he was a fool for staying, when he heard soft footsteps approaching. "I was afraid you might have left," Priscilla said, settling beside him on the bench. "Nearly did," Jacob admitted. "My father has that effect on people," she said with a small laugh. "He wants to meet you properly. I managed to convince him that tonight wasn't the right time." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "And when would be the right time to meet the Raven of the Rockies?" "When he's had time to get used to the idea that his daughter might be interested in someone," she replied candidly. "He's protective. After my mother died, it was just the two of us. Her death is why he gave up the outlaw life, you know, promised her he'd raise me proper." "He seems to have done right by you," Jacob observed. "He has," she agreed. "Though it hasn't been easy for either of us, the town has a long memory and not much capacity for forgiveness." She turned to face him fully. "That's why I noticed you, Jacob. You looked at me like you were actually seeing me, not just the outlaw's daughter." "Maybe it takes one broken person to recognize another," he said quietly. The honesty of his words hung between them in the night air. Then, with the same courage she'd shown facing down the drunken miner, Priscilla leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, almost innocent, but it shattered something in Jacob's carefully constructed defenses. When she pulled away, her eyes searching his in the moonlight, Jacob knew he was in dangerous territory. This wasn't part of survival. This was something else entirely, something that could hurt far worse than a bullet if it went wrong. "I should get back before my father comes looking," she whispered, "but I work at the store Tuesday through Saturday, and I ride along Pine Creek most Sunday afternoons." It was an invitation, clear as day. Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. As she stood to leave, he caught her hand. "Priscilla, this isn't, I'm not." "I know," she said simply. "Neither am I, but maybe we could figure it out together." She slipped away into the darkness, leaving Jacob with the unfamiliar sensation of hope, dangerous, fragile, and completely unexpected. The following weeks saw Jacob finding reasons to visit town more frequently than he had in the previous 6 months combined. Each trip to the general store brought conversations that slowly revealed more of Priscilla's life, her dreams of perhaps teaching someday, her love of books that transported her beyond the confines of Pine Ridge, her complicated relationship with a father whose notorious past both protected and isolated her. In turn, Jacob gradually shared pieces of himself. His childhood in Texas before the war, his skill with horses that had always come naturally, even the faded memories of his mother's cherry pie that no other could match. Small confidences, but for a man who had spent years saying as little as possible, they represented canyons crossed. Their Sunday afternoon rides became the highlight of each week. Away from the watchful eyes of the town, they would follow Pine Creek into the foothills, sometimes talking, sometimes riding in comfortable silence. Jacob found himself laughing for the first time in years, the sound rusty but genuine. "You should do that more often," Priscilla told him one Sunday as they sat by the creek, their horses grazing nearby. At 20, her face still carried youthful softness, but her eyes held wisdom beyond her years. "Laugh, I mean, it suits you." "Didn't have much reason to before," Jacob admitted, watching the sunlight play in her auburn hair. "And now?" she asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability she rarely showed. Instead of answering with words, Jacob leaned forward and kissed her, his hand gently cradling her face. Unlike their first kiss, this one lingered, deepening with a sweetness that made his heart ache with forgotten longing. When they parted, Priscilla's eyes remained closed for a moment, her lips curved in a smile. "I was beginning to think you might never do that again," she murmured. "I was afraid," Jacob confessed. "Still am." "Of what?" "Of this, of caring about someone in a world that takes more than it gives." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "The world does take, Jacob, it's taken from both of us, but it gives too if we're brave enough to accept it." It was during one of these Sunday rides, nearly 2 months after the church social, that their newfound happiness faced its first real test. They had ridden further than usual, following the creek to a small waterfall that created a perfect private swimming hole. The summer heat made the cool water inviting, though propriety kept them from doing more than removing boots to wade at the edge. They were laughing, splashing each other like children, when the sound of approaching horses silenced them both. Jacob instinctively moved in front of Priscilla, his hand going to the revolver he always wore. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Jacob recognized them immediately as the Harlow brothers, troublemakers known for running wild throughout the territory. The oldest, Silas, had spent time in the territorial prison for robbery, while the younger 2 had managed to avoid serious consequences for their various misdeeds. "Well, look what we found, boys," Silas called, his eyes fixed on Priscilla, the raven's little nestling all grown up. Jacob felt Priscilla tense behind him but was impressed by the steadiness of her voice. "Silas Harlow. Still causing trouble, I see." "Just passing through, darlin', heading north for a spell." Silas's gaze shifted to Jacob. "Making friends with the local ranch hands, your daddy know about this." "Miss O'Malley and I were just riding," Jacob said evenly. "Now we'll be on our way." The youngest Harlow brother, barely 20 and already developing his sibling's mean streak, spat into the water. "Heard the ravens gone soft. Living like a regular citizen, running a livery stable of all things." "Times change," Priscilla replied, her voice cool despite the tension Jacob could feel radiating from her. "People too." "Some people," Silas corrected with a nasty grin. "Others just pretend until the right opportunity comes along. Your daddy taught me that." Jacob didn't like the direction of this conversation. "We'll be going now," he repeated more firmly. "Hold on there, Cowboy." Silas dismounted, his brothers following suit. "We got history with the O'Malleys, rode with her daddy back in the day." "Ain't that right, Pris?" "Ancient history," Priscilla replied, "and I prefer Priscilla now." Silas laughed. "Getting proper in your old age. I remember when you were just a wild little thing, running around camp while your daddy planned jobs." Jacob felt her hand on his arm, a silent request not to react. He realized with sudden clarity that there was much about Priscilla's early life she hadn't shared. Before her father's retirement from outlawry, she would have been just a child in that world. "What do you want, Silas?" Priscilla asked directly. "Information, darlin', we're looking for your daddy, got a proposition for him, old time's sake." "My father's done with that life," she said firmly. "He's not interested in propositions." Silas stepped closer, too close for Jacob's comfort. "Maybe you should let him decide that. We heard about a payroll shipment coming through next month, big enough to set a man up for life." "Just like old times." "I said he's not interested," Priscilla's voice hardened, "and neither am I." The middle Harlow brother moved toward their grazing horses. "Pretty mare you got there, Priscilla, still riding Starlight, I see. Remember when your daddy stole that horse for your 15th birthday? Finest horse in the territory, belonged to that banker from Denver." Jacob felt Priscilla's fingers dig into his arm. The revelation that her beloved mare was stolen property was clearly meant to embarrass her in front of him. That's enough, Jacob said, his quiet voice carrying danger. Mount up and ride on. Silas laughed, or what, cowboy? You planning to take on all three of us? His hand drifted to his gun. What's O'Malley's daughter doing with a ranch hand anyway, slumming? In one fluid motion, Jacob drew and cocked his revolver. I won't ask again. There was a tense moment when Jacob thought Silas might draw, but the outlaw eventually raised his hands with a mocking smile. No need for bloodshed. We're just having a friendly conversation about old times. He backed toward his horse. Tell your daddy we came by, Priscilla. Tell him Silas says opportunity only knocks once. The brothers mounted up, but Silas had one parting shot. You know, cowboy, you might want to ask your lady friend about her own skills with cards and cons. Raven taught his daughter every trick he knew. Best little thief in the territory before she decided to play respectable. With that they rode away, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Jacob holstered his gun, turning to find Priscilla already pulling on her boots, her face closed and unreadable. Priscilla. Don't, she cut him off, just don't. We should talk about what just happened. Why? So you can look at me differently now. She wouldn't meet his eyes as she yanked on her second boot. I know that look, I've seen it all my life. Jacob stepped closer, gently taking her arm to stop her frantic movements. Priscilla, look at me. When she finally did, the vulnerability in her eyes nearly broke him. He realized she expected judgment, expected him to walk away now that he'd glimpsed the reality of her past. I don't care about who you were, he said quietly. I care about who you are. The simple declaration seemed to catch her off guard. She searched his face for any sign of deception and found none. My father was an outlaw, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And yes, I grew up in that world until I was 15. I learned things no child should know, how to mark cards. How to create diversions while my father's men robbed stagecoaches, how to spot a lawman by the way he wore his boots. Her chin lifted slightly. And yes, Starlight was a stolen gift. I didn't know it at the time. Jacob nodded, taking in her words without judgment. And now? Now I'm trying to live honestly, she said. Just like my father, we made a promise to my mother as she was dying. That we'd find a different way to live, that we'd make her proud. Jacob thought of all the ways the past shaped a person, how impossible it sometimes seemed to outrun its shadow. The Harlows. Will they cause trouble? Priscilla sighed, some of the tension leaving her body. Probably. They've been trying to pull my father back into that life for years. He's always refused. But now they're back. Yes, she looked up at him, vulnerability shifting to determination. Jacob, I need to warn my father, if they're planning something big. I'll take you home, he said immediately, retrieving their horses. As they rode back toward town, considerably faster than their leisurely pace earlier, Jacob processed what he'd learned. Priscilla had been raised in an outlaw camp, taught skills no respectable young woman would know. She was the daughter of one of the most notorious men in the territory, and none of it changed how he felt about her. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Somewhere along the line, despite his determination to remain detached and alone, Jacob Keller had fallen in love with Priscilla O'Malley. The confrontation with Michael O'Malley was inevitable. When they reached the livery stable, the former outlaw took one look at their faces and ushered them inside, away from curious eyes. At 45, O'Malley still cut an imposing figure, his movements suggesting a man who remained dangerous despite his respectable business. The Harlows, he said before they could speak, surprising them both. Sheriff already warned me they were in the area. What happened? Priscilla quickly explained their encounter, leaving nothing out. Jacob watched the interaction between father and daughter with interest. There was deep respect there and obvious love, but also a wariness that spoke of complicated history. When she finished, O'Malley's eyes settled on Jacob with renewed intensity. And now you know more about my daughter's upbringing than most. It wasn't a question, but Jacob answered anyway. Yes, sir. And you're still standing here. Yes, sir. O'Malley studied him for a long moment. Priscilla, give us a minute. She looked ready to protest, but eventually nodded. Don't scare him off, father, she said, touching Jacob's arm briefly before slipping outside. Once she was gone, O'Malley's demeanor shifted subtly, the respectable businessman giving way to the outlaw who had once terrorized the territory. "I've been watching you, Keller, asking questions. Sullivan says you're his best hand. Never causes trouble, keeps to himself." He moved closer. "Sheriff says you've got a past, military during the war, family killed after. Drifted for years before landing here." Jacob maintained eye contact despite the intimidation. "That's right. What are your intentions with my daughter?" The directness of the question demanded an equally direct answer. "I care for her, sir. More than I expected to care for anyone again." "She's not for men who care for her," O'Malley replied sharply. "She's for a man who would die for her, who would kill for her if necessary. Who would stand beside her knowing that half this territory still spits when they hear our name." Jacob didn't hesitate. "I would do all those things." O'Malley's eyebrows rose slightly. "Would you, even knowing what you now know about her past?" "About mine?" "The past is done," Jacob said simply. "We all carry it, but it doesn't define what comes next." Something shifted in O'Malley's expression, not softening exactly but recognition. "She says you understand her. That you don't judge." "I've got no right to judge anyone, sir." O'Malley nodded slowly. "The Harlows are dangerous, Keller, not just because they're outlaws but because they're desperate. And desperate men do stupid things. You think they'll try to force you to join them. I think they might try to use Priscilla to convince me." O'Malley's face darkened at the thought. "Which is why I'll be sending her to my sister's place in Denver until this blows over." Jacob felt a jolt of alarm at the thought of Priscilla leaving. "When?" "Tomorrow, first stage out." O'Malley studied his reaction. "Unless you've got a better suggestion." Jacob considered his words carefully. "The ranch where I work, Sullivan's place, it's 10 miles out of town, well-staffed with men who know how to handle trouble. She'd be safe there until the Harlows move on." "And conveniently close to you," O'Malley observed dryly. "Yes, sir, but also far enough from town that the Harlows wouldn't think to look there, especially if people believe she's gone to Denver." The former outlaw rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Sullivan and I have an understanding. He knows who I was, knows I've gone straight, might work." He fixed Jacob with a penetrating stare. "But if anything happens to her under your protection, Keller, what I do to you will make my outlaw days look like Sunday school." "Understood, sir." Jacob met his gaze steadily. O'Malley seemed satisfied with what he saw. "I'll speak to Sullivan tonight, get things arranged." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Keller, my daughter thinks she loves you." The statement hung in the air between them. "I'm still deciding whether that's good or bad for her," O'Malley continued. "But I know my daughter, when she sets her mind on something or someone, she doesn't waver." With that, he opened the door, calling Priscilla back inside to explain the new plan. The next 2 weeks at Sullivan's ranch established a new rhythm for Jacob. By day, he worked alongside the other hands, his reputation for quiet competence unchanged. But evenings found him at the main house, where Priscilla was staying as Sullivan's niece from back east to any who might inquire. Old man Sullivan, a widower whose own daughter had long since married and moved to California, seemed to enjoy having a young woman's presence in the house again. Priscilla helped with cooking and household tasks, read aloud in the evenings, and brought a liveliness to the ranch house that had been missing for years. Jacob found himself invited to dinner each night, at first by Sullivan's gruff command and later by unspoken agreement. The other hands raised eyebrows but said little, respecting both Jacob's privacy and Sullivan's clear approval of the arrangement. It was during these evenings that Jacob truly came to know Priscilla, not just the brave face she showed the town or the vulnerable woman he'd glimpsed in private moments, but the complete person. Her quick mind, her dry humor, her compassion, and yes, the traces of wildness from her unconventional upbringing. "Did you really know how to mark cards?" Sullivan asked one evening after she had thoroughly defeated both men at poker. Priscilla's eyes danced with mischief. "I still do, but I didn't need to cheat to beat either of you." Sullivan roared with laughter while Jacob shook his head in mock offense. "I've been hustled," he declared. "Consider it education," she replied with a grin. "My father always said knowing how cheaters work is the best protection against being cheated." O'Malley rode out to the ranch every few days, bringing news from town. The Harlow brothers remained in the area, asking questions about both O'Malley and his supposedly departed daughter. The sheriff was watching them but had no cause to run them out of town yet. "They're planning something," O'Malley said grimly during one such visit, "just haven't figured out what yet." Despite this shadow, the days at the ranch were among the happiest of Jacob's life. With each passing day, the walls he had built around himself crumbled further. He spoke more, laughed more, and allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. One evening, as they walked along the creek that ran through Sullivan's property, Priscilla took his hand and asked the question that had been building between them. "What happens when this is over, Jacob?" "When the Harlows are gone and I go back to town." He hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead, afraid to hope for too much. "What do you want to happen?" She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The setting sun painted her auburn hair with gold and fire. "I want us to continue. I want to see where it leads." Her green eyes held his steadily. "But I need to know if you want the same." Jacob took both her hands in his, more certain in this moment than he had been about anything in years. "Priscilla, before you I was just existing. Going through each day without really living it." He swallowed hard, finding words for feelings he'd kept buried. "I've been afraid of caring too much, of losing again. But I'm more afraid now of not having you in my life." Her smile bloomed slowly, brilliantly. "Is that your way of saying you love me, Jacob Keller?" "It's my way of saying I love you more than I thought possible," he replied, the words coming easier than he expected. "And that scares me half to death." Priscilla laughed, the sound pure joy as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Being scared together is better than being brave alone," she said before pulling him down for a kiss that promised everything. Later, as twilight deepened around them, they sat by the creek discussing possibilities. Jacob had savings from years of work with little to spend it on, enough to perhaps buy a small place of their own someday. Priscilla spoke of perhaps teaching, using the education her father had insisted upon despite their unusual life. "He always wanted better for me," she explained. "Even when we were living in outlaw camps, he made sure I had books, that I learned proper speech and manners." "He's a good father," Jacob acknowledged, though still terrifying. "He likes you," Priscilla assured him with a smile. "He wouldn't have let me stay here otherwise." As darkness fell, they walked back to the ranch house, each lost in thoughts of the future they might build together. Neither noticed the rider watching from the distant ridge, his form silhouetted briefly against the night sky before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning dawned with an unseasonable chill, clouds threatening rain as Jacob and two other hands rode out to check on cattle in the north pasture. They had just crested a ridge when Jacob spotted smoke rising from the direction of the ranch house. "Fire!" he shouted, already wheeling his horse around. His companions followed immediately, all three riding hard back toward the main buildings. As they drew closer, Jacob's heart nearly stopped. The smoke wasn't coming from the ranch house itself, but from the large barn nearby. Flames were already consuming the structure, the dry wood burning ferociously despite the damp weather. Jacob's only thought was of Priscilla. He urged his horse faster, reaching the ranch yard ahead of the others. Sullivan and the remaining hands were frantically working a bucket line from the well to the barn, trying to keep the flames from spreading to nearby buildings. "Priscilla!" Jacob shouted as he leapt from his horse. Sullivan pointed toward the house. "Inside, safe, we're trying to save what livestock we can." Relief washed through him, quickly followed by determination to help. Jacob ran toward the back of the barn where several horses were still trapped, their terrified whinnies audible even over the roar of the flames. He had just managed to free two horses when a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. Jacob dropped into a crouch, drawing his revolver as he scanned for the source of the gunfire. "That was a warning, Keller," a voice called from behind a water trough. "Next one goes between your eyes." Jacob recognized Silas Harlow's voice instantly. "What do you want, Harlow?" "The girl, we know she's here, not in Denver. Send her out and nobody else gets hurt." Cold fury washed through Jacob. "Not going to happen." More shots came in response, forcing Jacob to duck behind a rain barrel. He could hear Sullivan and the other hands taking cover as well, the fire momentarily forgotten as bullets flew across the ranch yard. Jacob counted 3 distinct weapons firing, all 3 Harlow brothers then. He risked a glance around the barrel and spotted one of the younger Harlows moving toward the house. With careful aim, Jacob fired, the bullet catching the outlaw in the leg. The man went down with a scream of pain. "You'll pay for that," Silas shouted, intensifying his fire. Jacob needed to reach the house, needed to make sure Priscilla was safe. He was calculating his next move when the distinct sound of a shotgun blast echoed across the yard. "Drop your weapons, Harlows," Michael O'Malley's voice boomed from the direction of the house. "Or the next shot won't be aimed at the ground." Jacob risked another look and saw O'Malley standing on the porch, Priscilla slightly behind him with a rifle in her hands. The former outlaw had clearly ridden hard to reach the ranch, likely alerted by someone in town who had spotted the Harlows heading this way. "Michael," Silas called. "Just the man we came to see." "I told you I'm not interested in your schemes," O'Malley replied. "Now drop your weapons before I forget I've gone respectable." Silas laughed, the sound ugly and desperate. "Can't do that, old friend. Job's already in motion. Payroll shipment leaves Denver tomorrow. All planned out just like old times. We need the Raven's touch." "And you thought threatening my daughter would convince me?" O'Malley's voice had gone dangerously soft. "You never were smart, Silas." Taking advantage of the distraction, Jacob signaled to Sullivan and the other hands. They began moving to surround the remaining Harlows, closing the circle. Silas must have sensed the trap closing. "Last chance, Michael, come with us, bring the girl to run interference like she used to, and we all get rich." "No," O'Malley said simply, "those days are over for both of us." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Silas rose from behind the trough, gun aimed not at O'Malley but at Priscilla. Jacob didn't hesitate, he broke cover and fired in the same instant O'Malley's shotgun roared. Silas Harlow went down, hit by both men's shots. The remaining brother threw down his weapon, raising his hands in surrender. In the sudden silence, broken only by the continued crackling of the fire, Jacob ran to the porch. Priscilla was unharmed, though pale with shock. She lowered her rifle and fell into his arms, her body trembling. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe." O'Malley watched them for a moment before turning his attention to the wounded Harlows. "Sullivan, we'd better get the sheriff out here." As the chaos gradually subsided, the fire contained though the barn was lost, Jacob kept Priscilla close. The nearness of losing her had crystallized everything in his mind. "Marry me," he said quietly as they sat on the porch steps, watching the others secure the surviving Harlow brothers. Priscilla turned to him with wide eyes. "What?" "Marry me," Jacob repeated, more certainty in his voice than he'd felt about anything in years. "I don't have much to offer yet, but I will, and I'll never stop trying to deserve you." Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, Jacob Keller, I'll marry you." O'Malley, approaching in time to hear their exchange, cleared his throat loudly. "Don't I get a say in this?" Jacob stood, still holding Priscilla's hand. "With respect, sir, I'm asking your daughter, not you." For a tense moment, O'Malley's expression remained stern, then unexpectedly he laughed. "You've got spine, Keller, I'll give you that." His eyes softened as he looked at his daughter. "Your mother would approve, Pris. She always said you'd need a man with quiet strength." It was the highest compliment O'Malley could give, and all 3 of them knew it. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Pine Ridge's small church. By then, the story of how Jacob had helped protect Priscilla and capture the Harlow brothers had spread throughout the town, transforming perceptions of both the quiet cowboy and the outlaw's daughter. Sullivan, impressed by Jacob's loyalty and quick thinking during the crisis, offered him the position of foreman with a small cabin on the property. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a home of their own where they could begin their life together. As Priscilla walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her auburn hair adorned with wildflowers, Jacob felt a sense of completion he'd never thought to find again. This woman, with her courage and her complicated past, had breached walls he'd believed impenetrable. Michael O'Malley, respectable businessman and former notorious outlaw, gave his daughter away with dignity and barely contained emotion. The same townsfolk who had whispered behind Priscilla's back for years now smiled and wiped away tears as the couple exchanged vows. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, Jacob said, his voice steady and sure. To build a life of honor and joy with you, and to love you until my last breath. I promise to be your partner in all things, Priscilla replied, her green eyes shining. To face each day's challenges and celebrations together, and to remind you that love is stronger than fear. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the church erupted in cheers. Later, at the celebration held at Sullivan's Ranch, even Sheriff Holloway raised a toast to the couple. To Jacob and Priscilla Keller, he called out, proof that in this wild territory, even the most unlikely hearts can find their match. That night, as they stood on the porch of their new cabin under a canopy of stars, Jacob held his wife close. Happy, he asked softly. More than I ever thought possible, Priscilla replied, looking up at her quiet cowboy with love, though I suspect Pine Ridge will be talking about us for years to come. Jacob smiled, no longer the silent, solitary man who had ridden into town believing the frontier held no place for tenderness. Let them talk, he said, echoing her words from long ago. We've got better things to do than worry about gossip. Like what? She asked with a teasing smile. Like building a legend of our own, he answered, drawing her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of love on the wild frontier they now faced together. And as the years passed, the story of the quiet cowboy and the outlaw's daughter did indeed become legend in Pine Ridge. How Jacob Keller, a man of few words but unfailing courage, had won the heart of Priscilla O'Malley, the reformed thief with emerald eyes. How their love had transformed not only their own lives, but touched the entire community, proving that second chances and new beginnings were possible even in the unforgiving West. Their children and grandchildren would proudly tell the tale long after Pine Ridge had grown from frontier town to prosperous city, the story of how love had been stronger than fear, and how two broken souls had found wholeness together in a place where many found only hardship. It was a legend worth telling, a love worth remembering,